A very good afternoon to everyone. Uh, we have the pleasure of having a talk on heritage attributes in the context of nationalism in India by one of our junior fellows, Dr. Milisa Srivastava. I extend a very warm welcome to her. Um, the subject of today's talk, heritage attributes in the context of nationalism in India, throws up many important issues and questions. As we are aware, celebration of a certain kind of culture from the past, inherited from the past, is an integral part of nation building in all parts of the world. Every nation has to decide what kind of heritage is most important for it. And heritage obviously can be of two kinds: tangible heritage in the form of, especially of architectural remains, monuments, etc., but many other things as well, archaeological remains, and so on, paintings and other works of art, and relatively intangible things which could certain kinds of works of art are also regarded as intangible, and of course uh, language, culture in general also. So the modern enterprise of nation making, nation building, therefore, has this heritage making. I would argue that heritage is not something which is inherent. In order to make it heritage, the nation has to be constituted. It has to be politically and historically constituted in order to become properly heritage. Just because something happened in the past or just because something has been inherited from the past doesn't mean that it would be found to be useful for the task of nation building and will therefore be taken up. And therefore, by definition, it is a selective process which every nation undertakes according to its own situations, according to its own preferences. Now, in the case of India, a very important example is how the national emblem and you know certain other things related to the identity of the nation were decided at the time of independence. There is a whole history behind it, why a certain kind of heritage, the Ashokan heritage, which is something, there was a movement from the 19th century onward which sort of identified Buddhism and Ashoka in a certain way, projected them in a certain light. And as it often happens, history often ends up becoming teleological. So you try to look for things that you want today in the past. So if you prefer, say, equality or freedom or gender rights or whatever it could be, then you are not content to say that, well, we want these things in the present and we are not concerned about what they were in the past. It is human nature to try to find reasons in the past also. And in that process, obviously, often history becomes teleological, and you try to prove. We have found all kinds of things, of course, and there are some very hilarious kind of teleological accounts of history available. But in the context of India, this happened in a certain way from the 19th century onward, when Buddhism was reconstructed as something which is very close to a modern rationalist kind of religion, which was the opposite of what popular Hinduism represented. And Ashoka, of course, became the torchbearer of that Hinduism. Anyway, I don't want to go any deeper into that, but the point is this, that this heritage, what heritage to select and to celebrate, both tangible and intangible, was a political project which was undertaken in the modern India Even before independence, the British tried to project a certain kind of heritage because the British had their own ideas about what India is. For most of them, India was just a geographical entity, and therefore, though they did a lot of groundwork as far as the preservation of Indian heritage is concerned, on the other hand, when it comes to the narrativization of what they had done, they presented a very different kind of narrative because it was not in their interest to present a coherent, unified narrative about the Indian heritage. So, but after independence, of course, a lot of work was done, both to preserve the monuments, to bring them under ASI, and to preserve other kinds of heritage, including paintings and other works of fine arts, languages, and manuscripts, which are a very important example. We have a whole national manuscript mission, which I believe has collected 2.5 million manuscripts from all parts of India, and this is a very huge collection, and many of them have been digitized as well. So I think Milisa's topic is it's a big topic, and probably she will she will try to cover some aspects of this huge topic in her talk today. So essentially, she is going to talk about how, through this process of identifying the things from the past that are critical for the narrative of a certain nation, the nation is formed, and of course it keeps changing from time to time according to the political preferences of the nation as it evolves over a period of time. So let me once again welcome everyone, and let me also welcome Milisa and request her to proceed with her lecture.
Thank you so much, sir, for these kind words. And we had a small discussion. I've been trying to get hold of sir and get a grip of how tedious it has been to be putting intangible and tangible heritage all together and making it a part of nation building. And through this presentation, I hope I'll be able to cover a certain portion of it. Good afternoon, respected fellows and members of this institution. I'll just start with a small narration of how heritage has been scrutinized in a period of time apart from history, and how it has been a very foundational grip of nation building for over roughly from 19th century onwards. So heritage is not subsequently the same as history, and the meaning of heritage has been described by Dutch scholar F.F.J. Schouten as historical facts highly processed through mythology, ideology, nationalism, local pride, romantic ideas, or just plain marketing into a commodity. In simplified terms, heritage refers to the cultural, historical, and traditional aspects that are passed down from generation to generation. In the 1990s, much of the academic literature on globalization heralded the decline of the nation state and the emergence of a new global order, one supposedly defined by the transnational connectivities, local intersections, and a seamless capitalist economy. More recently, it has been argued that cities are the new nation states of the 21st century, a declaration derived from their role in shaping global thinking and governance and the welfare of today's world economy. Elsewhere, much academic attention has been dedicated to the ideas of post-national forms of identity and to the possibilities of citizenships oriented less by prototypical nationalism and more by an ethos of cosmopolitan. Others, however, remain less persuaded by such claims and have argued that assertions concerning the death of the nation state as a key articulator of identity, politics, and economic governance are either fallacious, premature, or overblown. Cultural heritage is one arena where such themes, questions remain intriguing and where evidence can be cited to support or dispute each of the positions. From the many aspects of cultural heritage, both intangible and tangible, that could be explored in relation to these questions. It has been an attention on the built environment and in particular ways in which classical architecture and the notion of antiquity have figured in making of nation. There have been several examples which offered to provide an insight on historical perspective and illustrate how the coupling of a material culture of the deep past with the politics of nationalism and making of national citizens remain vibrant, and the ties of architecture and nationalism across different historical and geographical contexts. Constraints of space demand brevity and selectivity with an overarching aim of tracing some continuities between past and present, which once revealed beg important question about the ongoing appropriation of cultural heritage within the politics of nationalism. A wealth of literature has been published on the influence of classical antiquity on European thinking about the Renaissance onwards. As Professor Morley notes, classical antiquity was by far the best known pre-modern society by the 18th century, due both of its nature and familiarity. Accordingly, Roman and Greek civilizations were conceived to be sufficiently similar to the present for the comparison to yield presence and nuanced knowledge, unlike the crude contrast between, say, modern Europe and 19th century Africa, comparison of the sophisticated yet clearly different society and economy of classical antiquity with that of modernity that would throw the particular characteristics of the later into sharp relief. Morley then argues that the very nature of modernity in Europe, whether framed in economic, cultural, or governmental terms, continually invoke the texts and ideas of classical past, and it is unconceivable to think of modernity's ascendance, ambiguous and contested as it was, without acknowledging antiquity as its backdrop. His account traces various aspects of this relationship, notably the emergence of European historiography oriented by concepts of process and decline. In the words of Professor Woodward, as art, metaphor, allegory, and virtuous landscape ruins captured the imagination, a physical embodiment of feelings that tied immutable pasts of tumultuous presence. A critical turn came in the 19th century within the consolidations of nations into imagined communities, wherein process of nation building involved the careful appropriation of the material legacy of glorious past. As Hobsbawm and Ranger's influential collection reveals, the decades leading up to the end of 19th century were an instrumental period in the invention of tradition. There are traces of appropriation and symbolic loading or relatively recent past from the 17th and 18th centuries through practices such as sports activities or songs. Interestingly, however, they give less attention to those processes of heritage making rooted in much older histories and how these come to prefigure constructions of a national consciousness or collective memory. A nation, therefore, denotes not only a political organization, but also an entity which produces meanings through a system of cultural representations. A nation can be seen as a symbolic community which is created, affirmed through rituals such as flag hoisting, singing the national anthem, wearing certain kinds of garments, observing and commemorating particular events. The importance of national culture lies in the fact that it produces meanings in which we can identify. In the modern world, the national culture into which we are born is one of the principal sources of our cultural identity. Yet this identity is neither natural, nor given, nor unitary, but is formed within and in relation to representations. To quote Stuart Hall, people are not only legal citizens of a nation, they participate in the idea of the nation as represented in its national culture. A national culture is a discourse, a way of constructing meanings, which influences and organizes both our actions and our conceptions of ourselves. Hence, questioning the process. What is this national culture and how is it produced? Cultural nationalism generates a flowering of historical narratives and literatures as intellectuals establish cultural forums to campaign for and create the idea of a nation as a living principle in the lives of the people. It was primarily in the area of language, literature, and aesthetic forms that Indianness was formulated and was said to reside. In this context, Partha Chatterjee's argument about the search for autonomy for the colonial state has to be read with caution because nationalism needs to articulate its distinctiveness and yet follow its conventions which provide it and with the legitimacy of being and presenting itself like other nations. The experience of colonialism could not be removed by willing, it structured the very imaging of the nation. In much of the scholarly literature, cultural nationalism has become a stretched concept encompassing the full gamut of cultural practices and texts. Inspired by Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, researchers have gone in search of all those elements of nature that factor in the construction of national identity, from the extraordinary to the everyday and everything in between. For James Ferguson, India's long cultural past could be traced through shifting architectural styles and new technology of photography enabled the objective documentation of both changes and continuities across time and space. Indeed, for Ferguson, India's mountain ranges, craggy rocks, sun-baked plains, torrential waterfalls, and haunting wilderness offered an altogether more exotic aesthetic than the domesticated order of the English landscape. Interestingly, such features of nation provided the evocations of a cultural past characterized by decay and degeneration. Soon after his return to London, Ferguson published picturesque illustrations of ancient architecture in Hindustan in 1848. His depictions of the subcontinent's monumental past combined the romantic, evocative aesthetic of the picturesque with an attempt to convey an authenticity through order and meticulous detail. This sense of order extended outwards from a depiction of architectural features towards a historiography, a knowledge that would subsequently become a critical to assertions of an Indian nationalist rhetoric. The use and interpretation of heritage plays a highly significant role in this process and will thus directly help to determine the future form of the Indian nation state. The concept of cultural nationalism has for quite some time been on the center stage of global debate and academic discussion. Culture, in all its facets and dimensions, is a crucial constituent and instrument of human development. It is a state of being, a mode of thinking, a way of living, a set of commonly shared values, belief patterns, practices, and efforts. It is a complex whole comprising stock of knowledge, beliefs, customs, conduct, morals, law, and artistic, scientific, and technological pursuits, humanities, and social sciences. It is an individual as well as social affair. It is a totality of heritage borne by a society and crystallization of material, mental, intellectual, and spiritual wealth generated and preserved by the society. It contributes to the discovery of meaning of life, enhances quality of life. Thus, it enriches, enlarges fullness of life, brings delight of mind, and sharpens intellect and ushers in plenitude of peace and bliss. Emphasizing national identity and the necessity of national awakening, Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay was against the Western type of narrow nationalism. His idea of nationalism was culture, based on the principle of dharma, which is sustaining principle of the entire cosmos. Nation is an organic whole which is to function in harmony and cooperation with the entire cosmos. He rejected the idea of regional consciousness and advocated common national consciousness widening into cosmic consciousness. Pointing out the significance of national consciousness, he maintained that there should, of course, be political independence, but it becomes meaningful only in the context of national identity and cultural independence. Under alien subjugation, a nation like individual becomes a prey to numerous ills, and when its natural instincts get disregarded or mutilated and perverted. He argued that the diseased organs are to be amputated and the healthy ones are to be nourished. He averred the fact that it was essential that we think about our own national identity. Without this identity, there is no meaning of independence, nor can independence become the instrument of progress and happiness. As long as we are unaware of our national identity, we cannot recognize and develop all our potentialities. Indian culture has a hoary past and a pretty ancient history with inspiring ideas and ideals. India has the fortune of possessing one of the finest cultures in the world in the form of Vedic wisdom. It is characterized by integral, holistic, and spiritual way of reality and a way of life based on that. It advocates fundamental unity of all existences, both animate and inanimate. Every existence is at bottom spiritual, pulsating with life and consciousness. Everything in this cosmos has common source and sustenance. In fact, whatever existed, whatever exists, and whatever shall come into existence are all the manifestations of the same divine being, declares the Purush Sukta of the Rig Veda. The larger parts of the Yajur states that in the mutating world, every element is divine and is permeated by the divine. It is one unitary self-existing principle which manifests itself diversely, says the Nasadiya Sukta of the Rig Veda. It is also experienced and expressed diversely. Indian culture has been holistic and integrated, Catholic and symbiotic. This has provided an inherent vitality. There are some noble ideas and ideals contained in it which are not only endearing but also liberating. This is why it has permeating influence within and outside India. This is what Urdu poet Muhammad Iqbal has very convincingly pointed out some time back in his well-known poem Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, in which he proudly declares, कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी, सदियों रहा है दुश्मन दौरे जहां हमारा, narrated in Tarana Hind in 1904. Iqbal refers to the survival instinct of Indian culture, which contains inherent vitality and the perennial force. It has a vitalizing and animating force of its own, and yet it does not deny nourishment and nurture from extraneous sources as well as by incorporating and absorbing them on its own. Both the variety and continuous identity are the assets of Indian culture. It is living and has vitality to live. Because of this orgasmic nature and character, it displays a unity in multiplicity and becomes conducive to self-identity and self-preservation, as well as group solidarity and group cohesion. As Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay has put in his integral humanism, it is essential that we think about our national identity. Without this identity, there is no meaning of independence, nor can independence become the instrument of progress and happiness as long as we are unaware of our national identity. Indian identity is embedded in the multifaceted Indian culture, which has been internal bedrock of India's glorious past, adventurous present, and bright future. In order to discern Indian identity, one has to look precisely to the diverse cultural and subcultural traditions which have evolved over times, in which the Indian people have been born or nurtured, and by which their general human sensibilities have been refined and shaped. This is so whether they are Indian citizens or Indian diaspora or adopted Indians. The Vedas constitute the pristine foundation of Indian culture. They exhort for establishment of a virtuous society. They inculcate a healthy and robust attitude towards life. They have provided ideas and ideals, moral and spiritual values, beliefs and practices and patterns of behavior, individual and social on the basis of deep insight into the nature of reality, which have universal appeal and inherent vitality to survive in spite of all odds and vagaries of history, which still continues to provide life sap into its adherents and votaries. It would be certainly beneficial to the whole humanity if those sublime ideas are reiterated in their pristine purity so the discerning human mind can evaluate and emulate them. Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay floated a seminal concept of Chitti, which comprehends individual consciousness, national consciousness, and cosmic consciousness. Chitti provides self-identity and autonomy to all these. It is the animating principle. Deen Dayal Upadhyay particularly emphasized Chitti of a nation, calling it as the soul of a nation. It is on its foundation that a nation rises and develops and becomes strong and virile. Strength and energy activating a nation is Virat. It is the vital breath. It infuses strength in every element of the nation, but it has to be channelized by Chitti. It is Chitti which awakens a nation's Virat. Every nation should have this vital energy for its survival and enhancement. Every nation should try to preserve, protect, augment. This is what Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo also insisted on in their discourses. The concept of India as a territory goes back as far as the 3rd century BC with the Mauryan Empire. Since then, many other kingdoms and empires have occupied a large part of the same area, including the Chalukyas, the Vijayanagar Empire, the Delhi Sultanate, and the Mughal Empire. Despite being territorially unified under the British, the Government of India Act 1935 created separate electorates based on religion, creating the conditions for the rise of the sectarian nationalism and eventually leading to partition in 1947, a policy aptly described as divide and rule. India has been known for its archaeological heritage since the earliest days of the discipline. The Paleolithic artifacts having been discovered as early as 1863 in Chennai. Numerous travelers and the British officials had reported on the archaeological richness of India, but it was, however, the discovery of the Indus civilization by Dayaram Sahni in 1920 that first made a major difference to the India perceptions of their own past. With partition in 1947, the main Indus sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro became part of Pakistan. So Indian archaeologists' attention was quickly focused on finding further examples of the civilization within their new borders in order not to lose their distinction. At the same time, Indian historians began to write their own books, which naturally tended to be anti-colonial in the nature, with the aim of refuting British claims that India had always been a diverse collection of ethnic groups that could only be governed as a whole by outsiders, and that any evidence of a highly developed civilization was the result of external influences. From independence onwards, the Archaeological Survey of India and a growing number of Indian university archaeology departments have produced a large body of excellent, scientifically balanced work that has greatly enriched our knowledge of the highly diverse common history and prehistory of South Asia, a point that has to be considered. At the same time, however, various actors with more narrow nationalist aims have taken a much more selective and exclusive approach. While they are a minority, their voices are often heard the loudest because their well publicized claims are aimed to coincide with major political or communal issues of the day. And being highly emotive, they often create facts that go unscrutinized by the wider public. The concept of Indian nationhood has always been best summed up by great Congress leader and intellectual Bipil Chand Pal. He says, national differentiation among us therefore have not been based upon territorial demarcations only, or upon political or economic competitions and conflicts, but upon differences of culture. And that special character is the very soul and essence of what we know and understand as nationalism. There is by no means a mere political idea or ideal. It is something that touches every department of our collective life and activity. It is organized in our domestic, our communal, our social, our socio-economic institutions. In fact, politics form, from some point of view, the least important factor of this nation idea among us. The so-called political institutions of Europe might indeed hinder instead of helping the growth of our national life, while under conceivable conditions, more political subjection might not be able to even touch the outermost fringe of that life. India has always been seen by our historians as a unique example of unity in diversity. In spite of regional linguistic religious and ethnic differences dividing India into apparently irreconcilable social groups, we too have found India one and united. National integration implies the spirit of one nation despite diversities of castes, creeds, religions, languages, and regions. The feeling of unity and harmony among societies and communities is essential for the strength of progress of any country. It deepens mutual relations among all the people of living in a country. In fact, national integration strengthens the identity of a nation. India is a country where people of different religions, culture, tradition, creeds live together. So because of these variations, differences among the people over some issues are likely to emerge. National integration works as a thread which ties the people in oneness despite all such differences. It is the beauty of this country that a festival related to any religion is celebrated together with all the communities participating in it. The people visit each other's place to meet, greet, and congratulate them on religious occasions. This is why India is known as a country of unity in diversity. During the last 2 centuries or more, nationalism has emerged as one of the most compelling of political creeds which has helped to shape history. It has inspired intense loyalties as well as deep hatreds. It has united people as well as divided them, helped to liberate from other oppressive rule, as well as the cause of conflict and bitterness and wars. It has been a factor in the breakup of empires and states. Nationalist struggles have contributed to the drawing and redrawing of the boundaries of states and empires. At present, a large part of the world is divided into different nation states, although the process of reordering of state boundaries has not come to an end and separatist struggles within existing states are common. People who see themselves as a nation also embody a sense of continuity of historical identity. That is, nations perceive themselves as stretching back into the past as well as reaching into the future. They articulate for themselves a sense of their own history by drawing on collective memories, legends, historical records to outline the continuity of the idea of nation. Thus, nationalists in India invoked its ancient civilization and cultural heritage and other achievements to claim that India had a long and continuing history as a civilization and that this civilization continuity and unity is the basis of the Indian nation. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, wrote in his book The Discovery of India, though outwardly there was diversity and infinite variety among the people, everywhere there was that tremendous impress of oneness which held us all together in ages past, whatever political fate or misfortune has befallen on us. Shared historical identity plays an important role in creating a sense of oneness. It is a shared vision of the future and the collective aspiration to have an independent political existence that distinguishes groups from nations. Members of a nation share a vision of the kind of state they want to build. They affirm, among other things, a set of values and principles such as democracy, secularism, and liberalism. These ideals represent the terms under which they come together and are willing to live together. It represents, in other words, their political identity as a nation. Many people believe that a shared political vision about the state and society we wish to create is not enough to bind individuals together as a nation. They seek instead a shared cultural identity, such as a common language or a common descent. There is no doubt that speaking the same language makes it easier for us to communicate with each other. And sharing the same religion gives us a set of common beliefs and social practices. Observing the same festivals, seeking the same holidays, and holding the same symbol valuable can bring together, but it can also pose a threat to the values that we cherish in a democracy. There are two reasons for this. One, all major religions in the world are internally diverse. They have survived and evolved through a dialogue within the community. As a result, there exists within a religion a number of sects who differ significantly in their interpretation of the religious texts and norms. If we ignore these differences and forge an identity on the basis of a common religion, we are likely to create a highly authoritative and oppressive society. Two, Most societies are culturally diverse. They have people belonging to different religions and languages living together in the same territory. To impose a single religious or linguistic identity as a condition of belonging to a particular state would necessarily exclude some groups. It might restrict the religious liberty of the excluded groups or disadvantaged who do not speak the national language. Either way, the ideal that we cherish most in democracy, namely equal treatment and liberty for all, will be severely limited. For both these reasons, it is desirable to imagine a nation in political rather than cultural terms. That is, democracies need to emphasize and expect loyalty to a set of values that may be enshrined in the constitution of the country rather than adherence to a particular religion, race, or language. Recent years have seen the broadening of heritage definition to include cultural elements like memory, music, language, dialects, oral history, tradition, dance, and craft skill. Within the in- international classification of heritage, there is a tendency to distinguish between heritage and intangible heritage. The goal of Laura Jane Smith was not only to merge these two notions of heritage so that intangible heritage becomes just heritage, but also to redefine all heritage as inherently intangible. The values and meanings symbolized or represented at and by heritage sites and cultural practices are the subject of matter of conservation and preservation practices. We deal with the value and meanings, including emotions, memory, and cultural and experiential knowledge. This is regardless of whether we are dealing with the tangible or intangible representations of heritage. Value and meaning constitute the real subject of heritage preservation and management processes. And as such, all heritage is intangible, whether these values and meanings are symbolized by physical sites, places, landscapes, or other physical representations, or are expressed through language, dance, oral history, or other forms of intangible heritage. Rather than focusing on the cultural object or event itself, emphasis should be placed on the cultural impact of heritage. Professor Dolores Hayden from Yale University presented case studies that illustrate the power of place in evoking memory, emotion, and belonging that can be used to rethink the past and the present. The concept of affect, as defined by her, can also be interpreted as an embodiment of thought and emotion anchored in physical space. As embodied with these particular values and meanings or effects, this concept relates the physical sense of heritage to traditional views of intangible heritage as performance or acts. When developing this sense of heritage, traditional or common sense of ideas of place and performance need to be reconsidered. Memory and history are often viewed as opposing forces. Viewing memory as subjective and unreliable is possible, whereas history focuses on accumulating facts within an authorized narrative. In other words, heritage sites may aid societies in remembering, but the legitimacy or facts of the remembrance or commemoration are given attention and not the associated emotions. The relationship between history and collective memory is also discussed by Maurice Hopswatch. The concept of history as a universalizing and objective narrative that clearly separates the past from the present must be distinguished from collective memory and separates the memory and its subjective and unself-conscious function. In contrast to history, memory is closely connected to the present through individual and collective acts of remembering. In the same way as heritage, memories can be owned, they cannot be opened and read as if they were books in a library. Our ability to conceive of the world depends on our continued ability to remember and forget. Past events cannot be understood solely within their context. The present constantly writes the meaning of the past and the memories and histories we construct about it. In the present, there is no past, nor there is a past in the past. Only the present exists, within which the past is constantly recreated. The past does not create to influence the present, but is understood and reshaped entirely through the dominant discourses of the present. Studies in social psychology indicate that the language is an important component of this process, as how we talk about our individual collective memories shapes and forms our memories as well as frames the process of remembering and forgetting. A cultural collective memory is shaped in the present by commemorative events and is continually reshaped by the language employed by members of that culture to frame and articulate their collective memory. Recollections are triggered by landmarks that we always carry with us. To retrieve them, we must look around ourselves, consider others, and situate ourselves within the social framework. The study of history, on the other hand, examines past periods chronologically as distinct units of history, and on the other hand, memory is an important element of identity formation as it is personal, unlike professional historical narratives, and therefore it has an impact. It may be worth considering why some traditions are privileged over others, whether invented or not, and why some are actively forgotten. This can be explained by the embodiment of memory into sites of memory. When tradition and memory are equated with the material items, common sense legitimacy is strengthened. The notion that the tradition are material is a powerful control and regulating mechanism here, and if an activity or ritual breaks the material tradition, the memories it represents becomes part of history and no longer part of collective or living memory and becomes separate from the present. It may therefore be possible to forget or marginalize those groups or individuals who oppose the collective sense of legitimate cultural expressions of social and cultural memory, which in turn can have a negative impact on the power these groups exert in society. As well as being represent as well as being symbolic, heritage is also a process, a performance where values are negotiated and meanings are interpreted and performed. The physicality conveys the idea that value and meaning are immutable, yet they are always subject to negotiation and change. In this way, heritage goes beyond representing or constructing a range of identities. The value that support identity or underlie memory are also used to construct ways of understanding and making sense of the present. We define heritage as a sense of place, not in just in terms of abstract identity, but to also define ourselves as nations, communities, and individuals in our cultural, social, and physical environments. We negotiate our sense of social place or identity and a sense of cultural space or belonging through heritage, especially its material representations. Nations, societies, communities, and individuals use heritage to express, facilitate, and construct a sense of identity, self, and belonging based on the representational power of place to base experiences on physical realities. A place is a social construction. It is not simply a location for people to do things. It is not an inert container. Rather, they are politicized, culturally relative, historically specific, local, and multiple constructions. The concept of heritage as a place can not only be conceived as a representation of human experience in the past, but also to influence current experiences and perceptions of the world. As a result, a heritage can symbolize identity and belonging for a particular individual or group. Nevertheless, it may also shape an individual's response and experiences at that location and frame the social meanings these encounters generate. The transition from patriotism to nationalism in the Indian subcontinent took place through the historical process of interaction of multiple social groups. In this process, the culminating of geographical identity of the people acknowledged the collectiveness at all levels and provided them space and respect to flourish. But the advent of colonial authority and their disastrous intervention led to a particular mutation in this historically inherited cultural community, which resulted in growth of nationalism crystallized by a new social and political development. This unique idea was superheaded by the middle class of the 19th century, which found it as a weapon to fight colonialism. Since then, the principles within nationalism have been changing according to the anti-colonial movement's social, cultural, and political needs, but their great efforts were located in the cultural space. For example, Swami Vivekananda explored India's nationalist vision into spirituality, morality, and religion. Vivekananda explored India's national. He perceived these fundamentals as the past historical heritage of India on which the idea of nation to be imagined. But this spiritual nationalism found significant political space in the writings and speeches of Sri Aurobindo. He underlined Indian nationalism on the basis of religious spiritualism. He emphasized that the idea of religious did not indicate Hinduism, but included all tradition, favoring the motherland's service with enthusiasm. According to Sri Aurobindo, nationalism is not a political creed, but a religion in which we attempt to visualize God in the nation and our countrymen across caste, class, culture, and religion. This religious nationalism advanced the idea of Hindutva through intellectual efforts of V.D. Savarkar in the late 1930s. According to this, the idea of nationalism was based on three fundamentals: motherland, Matrabhumi, land of ancestors, Pitrabhumi, and holy land, Punyabhumi. Savarkar, through his writings, clarified that it was not confined to the adherent of the Hindu faith, rather indicates a concept of Indianness, and admitted all faiths in his concept of nationalism, which acknowledge India on the three above fundamentals. The idea of Indian nationalism also interacted with the concept of internationalism, which has its modern roots in the ideas of Swami Vivekananda, who perceived in it the idea of universal humanism. In 20th century, Rabindranath Tagore highly celebrated this concept and viewed nationalism in a cosmopolitan vision. He was against hardening religious, linguistic, and other identities. He explored Indian nationalism through the lens of ancient Indian philosophy. Tagore associated his idea of nationalism through the concepts of peace, harmony, welfare, and most importantly, humanity. He believed that the environment of pride and arrogance nationalities of the West or narrow nationalism, the world requires a broader sense of nationalism based on the above fundamentals. Such nationalism will acknowledge at all levels culture, religion, and linguistics, etc. But it was only possible when the liberation of the nation was asserted from the hands of the colonial regime. Therefore, Mahatma Gandhi, unlike Tagore, perceived the idea of internationalism within the folds of nationalism by broadening its horizon and making it more assimilative and tolerant. Gandhi believed that Indian nationalism is a historically inherited common consciousness deeply rooted in the Indian culture and tradition, and particularly pilgrimages. He added that this consciousness was based on accommodating the capacity of Indian civilization, which kept on assimilating different foreign cultures and religions by making them their own art for centuries. He outlined that India can assert its inclusive civilization characteristics and develop into a single nation by withering away core religious, social, and linguistic differences. The main critic of Gandhi, Dr. Ambedkar, located his idea of nationalism into the spirit of dignity and the suppressed people and the construction of an inclusive social identity. Therefore, he advocated in annihilating those political policies creating differences, discrimination among the people. Thus, Indian nationalism was the political mutation of patriotism, a socially and historically active sentiment of attachment to India's land, languages, and culture that evolved into an inclusive ideology through the intellectual interactions of active ideas during the multiple phases of India's struggle for freedom. Despite differences in certain principles in the fold of their national vision, there was a common consensus on certain ideas like inclusiveness, pluralism, social justice, annihilation of discriminatory policies and practices. Thank you so much, sir.